What's up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about GTO Cbetting. In particular, we'll have a look at how various flop textures impact on GTO correct cbet sizing. Let's start off with a very quick overview of the current state of cbetting in the modern game. At some point in poker history, 1/3 cbets became very popular, and at the time of making this content, 33% pot size cbets are about as common as they've ever been. When the average opponent does size up and use a half pot, 2/3, or even rarely an overbet sizing, we find that these larger sizings are used less frequently than GTO, and they're often less balanced and more weighted towards strength. So when GTO does use a large cbet sizing, it obviously includes a decent range of more speculative holdings to make sure the cbetting range is not overly strong, whereas the average opponent doesn't do that. They size up, it's usually an indication that they are stronger than average. The side effect of the overutilization of the 1/3 sizing is that the modern player pool is dealing with 1/3 sizings adequately. That's not to say the player pool is not making mistakes, but what we find in the current game is that the player pool plays better against 1/3 cbet sizings than any other sizing. The mistakes the pool makes against larger sizings are more significant compared with the mistakes they make against a 1/3 sizing. So from an exploitative perspective, the 1/3 sizing is not a very attractive proposition. Now, we're not here today to talk about exploitative poker. We're going to focus on GTO principles, but keep in mind, exploitatively, if we are hammering that 1/3 pot size bet every time, that's actually the least good sizing to be using overall, according to population data. We're mostly going to be considering situations in single raised heads up pots in this episode of the Red Chip Poker podcast, but this information does apply very well to 3-bet pots also. Just keep in mind that the average sizing in 3-bet pots will be smaller. So as a simple example, we see that overbetting occurs very frequently in single raised pots, especially on certain board textures, whereas in 3-bet pots, overbetting doesn't happen anywhere near as frequently. Another thing to keep in mind is that very small sizings are encouraged by the solver in 3-bet pots. We're talking about cbet sizings less than 1/3 pot. For example, if we give a GTO solver the option to bet 10% or 15% as the cbet sizing in a 3-bet pot, the solver will use that option very frequently, sometimes more frequently than any other bet sizing option. So it's worth keeping that in mind if constructing an exploitative game plan. No one uses the 10% cbet sizing in a 3-bet pot in the current game, at least not very many players. That means the pool is going to be relatively less skilled when facing those extremely small cbet sizings, which may allow us to generate exploitative opportunities. And similar things can be said about overbetting the flop in single raised heads up pots. Many GTO-based strategies do employ turn overbets, so we might commonly see the line from a GTO reg, where they underbet the flop and then overbet the turn. But in the current game, relatively few regs employ a flop overbetting strategy. Whereas on certain flop textures, according to GTO, the overbet should be a very pronounced and high frequency aspect of our strategy. Let's jump into some examples. Part of the objective here today is to differentiate between the key different types of flop textures. We'll be breaking them down into broad groups, and we're going to start with what we can refer to as a single Broadway texture. An example would be Ace 7-2 Rainbow, or perhaps Queen 7-2 two-tone. And we find that cbetting strategy on single Broadway textures is heavily focused around 33% pot. In other words, the sizing that players are using very consistently anyway, according to population data, does actually coincide with the best sizing specifically on a single Broadway texture like a 7-2 Rainbow. So we see that the solver may sometimes size up to half pot, but the solver doesn't overbet on something like an ace 7-2 texture and doesn't even really use 75% pot sizing on this board either. However, what we do find is the lower the high card, the more prevalent those larger sizings become. So on an ace 7-2 rainbow, we don't see any overbetting, but on something like a jack 5 deuce rainbow, we start to see slightly larger sizings creeping in. And this brings us to our next pattern, which is going to be a higher card on the board, but not a Broadway card. So we'll refer to this as low, high, dry. So we're saying a low, high card, but a fairly dry texture. So we're not thinking about something that's heavily coordinated in terms of straight possibility. Examples include 10-5 deuce rainbow or 9-4 deuce two-tone. Now, I guess technically the 10 could be considered a Broadway, but it doesn't matter too much. There's a smooth distribution here, ranging from the single Broadway textures down to these low, high, dry textures. And as we get to the lower high cards, like a high card of 10 or a high card of 9, we start seeing overbet frequencies becoming much more prevalent. Now, we can also say very specifically which types of hands like to overbet on these low, high, dry textures. And if you check out one of these board textures in the solver, we'll see that a lot of that overbetting range is being driven by overpair combos. So if we take something like 9-4 deuce and imagine we hold pocket 10s, we could perhaps describe that pocket 10s as a vulnerable overpair. It's strong in the sense that it's an overpair, but it's vulnerable in the sense that we don't really want to allow our opponent to see any jack, queen, king, or ace on the turn. And as a result, overbet sizings are incentivized. Of course, when we do make use of an overbet range according to GTO, that overbetting range needs to be balanced out with draws. There's going to be some fairly strong draws, like nut flush draws, if it's a two-tone texture, for example. But according to GTO, there should also be some fairly weak draws, things like single overcard, backdoor flush draw type combos, for example. Now, although we see overbetting occurring on these low, high, dry textures, we also see the small sizing being used because there are many hands within the ranges involved that still prefer the smaller sizings. So we see on these types of textures a fairly mixed approach to bet sizing where some hands want to overbet, some hands want to bet 75%, but there are still a decent chunk of hands that actually want to bet in the smaller sizing ranges, so 33% or 50% pot. On most textures, these still account for the majority of the Cbetting that goes on, but a decent number of extra combos are now introduced into the overbet range on the low, high, dry textures. Now, one of the interesting things about low, high, dry texture is if we just tweak it slightly. So instead of 9-4 deuce, we have 9 deuce deuce. Now, those textures might seem very similar, but the key difference is the 9 deuce deuce is a paired texture. And as soon as we introduce a pair to the texture, for example, 9 deuce deuce, or it could be a queen, queen 7 texture, all of a sudden the overbetting strategy almost completely disappears. And once again, the best sizings are going to be in the 33% pot range or 50% pot range. So we're learning here that certain textures do coincide with a very heavy 1/3 Cbet frequency, but other textures don't. A paired texture is an example of one of the textures that does coincide very well with using a 1/3 sizing the majority of the time. An interesting experiment, if you have access to a solver, is to have a look at how often the solver overbets in a regular Cbet situation. It can be in position or out of position, by the way, but we see most overbetting happens in position. Overbetting does happen out of position, but it's lower frequency, but it does happen on the same textures, incidentally. Either way, the experiment is to put in a 9 deuce deuce paired texture into the solver and have a look at how often overbet strategies are used. You'll see very infrequent overbets on such a texture, and then to compare it to a 9-3 deuce. So it seems like it should be the same texture, right? We wouldn't think of 9 deuce deuce and 9-3 deuce being hugely different from a strategic perspective. but according to the solver they are, because on the 9-3 deuce, those overpair combos are driving an overbet strategy, whereas on the 9 deuce deuce, everything just ends up in a small bet sizing range. Moving on now to our next texture, we'll describe this as the double Broadway texture. And these are extremely interesting from a strategic perspective. And this is an example of one of the board textures where blindly c-betting 1/3 likely means that we are not getting the best of it. Now, hopefully the term double Broadway is fairly self-explanatory. Examples include ace queen 4 or king jack 5. And overbets reign supreme on these textures. And this is especially true if there's an ace as part of that double Broadway texture. So just to give you a simple example, imagine button versus big blind. So the situation is we've open raised on the button, big blind has defended against the open raise, and the board texture comes down ace, queen, 4, rainbow. So it's a double Broadway texture. In terms of the distribution of different sizings used on a certain solver model, we see 37% overbet. The sizing that the solver was given is 125% pot. 37% overbet. What about other sizings? Did the solver also use smaller sizings? Yes, it did. But the distribution of those other sizings was less than 5%. So we've got 37% overbet sizings and 5% other sizings for a total c-bet frequency of around 42%. By the way, just as an aside here, if that sounds like a fairly low c-bet frequency, just keep in mind that the player pool is drastically over c-betting, especially with the introduction of the 1/3 c-bet, because players are closing their eyes and c-betting a bunch of textures. The end result is a c-bet frequency which is significantly more aggressive than GTO. C-bet frequencies are a little bit more relaxed in terms of frequency compared to the way the modern environment is actually playing. So just thinking about those frequencies, 37% overbet, 5% other sizings. How can a simplification to 33% pot be best here? Now, this is just an open-ended question for you to answer and to think about. If overbetting is so heavily incentivized, what is the likelihood that hammering the 1/3 c-bet sizing is actually getting the best of it in terms of strategy? And we're not going to try and prove or disprove that with any complex math or solver models, but my opinion is it seems fairly unlikely. If we are constantly using a small sizing in a situation where theory says, actually, large sizing is incentivized, should be used most of the time, there seems a very good chance to me that that is not the best strategy in that situation. Besides, I also like to think, at least briefly, about the exploitative benefits of that overbet sizing, and there are at least two. The first is that certain opponents, often regs, simply have a tendency to overfold against overbets, and they're often doing this for very logical reasons. We've already discussed in this podcast episode how when an average opponent sizes up, especially overbets, for example, we can give them credit for having an above average hand strength. Well, if our opponent is a good reg that knows that, then the side effect is they should be folding exploitatively more often against that overbet. So that's reason number one why incorporating overbets on double Broadway flops is a great idea. Specific regs might be overfolding. But the other thing to consider here is what we've seen with the 1/3 sizing is because it's used so frequently, the player pool has become relatively skilled at defending against that specific bet sizing. What kind of skill level do we think the player pool has defending against an overbet sizing? It's very unlikely they've had a high level of exposure to the flop overbet sizing in the modern game, simply because many players never overbet the flop. It's nowhere near as frequent as the 33% pot sizing. If you had some time on your hands, you could think about this following experiment as well. See how many poker training resources you can find on defending against flop c-bets in single raised heads up pots. Now, see how many poker training resources you can find specifically for defending against flop overbets in the same situation so a c-bet scenario in single raised heads up pots. I'm guessing there's a fairly good chance that you won't find any resource on defending against flop overbets in single raised heads up pots. If you do find such a resource, it's probably going to be a very small percentage of the overall training resources that you uncover. Now, on some level, the reason why overbetting is incentivized on a double Broadway texture is because it connects with the pre-flop aggressor, and it also conveys a nutted equity distribution advantage to the pre-flop aggressor. So what that means when translated is on something like an ace-queen 4, imagine we've open raised on the button, big blind has cold called. Well, we as the aggressor on the button still have pocket aces in our range, that's a stone cold nuts. We also have pocket queens. Big blind doesn't have those holdings because presumably he's going to 3-bet both pocket aces and pocket queens with 100% frequency in that scenario. So that's what drives the overbetting strategy. We have the nutted equity distribution. So what happens when we transition from a double Broadway flop to a triple Broadway flop? And we're going to lump two different textures here together. We're going to think about Code Red and Crusher. Now, the idea is, first of all, these are nicknames, so you might not necessarily come across these same terms outside the context of this podcast episode. But the key aspect uniting the textures in this category is that they have some kind of straight connectivity. So something like an Ace-Queen-Jack, which is a triple Broadway. Obviously, a straight is directly possible. And something like a 10-9-8 or a 9-8-7 or a 9-8-6. You can see all of these board textures have the ability to flop a direct straight. So when a board texture has the ability to flop a direct straight, I often refer to it as a Code Red texture. But specifically, if all three of those cards are also Broadway cards, so it's a triple Broadway texture, I refer to it as a Crusher texture. Again, it's just a term that I made up. You can use triple Broadway for the 3 Broadway cards if you prefer, and you could use Code Red for 3 mid-range connected cards, or you can make up your own terminology, that's fine, so long as we're clear on what types of texture we're talking about here. Now, starting with that triple Broadway texture, so the Ace-Queen-Jack. Now, that might seem like it's very good for the aggressor because it doesn't just have 2 Broadways, it now has 3 Broadways, right? So does that mean that even larger overbet sizings are incentivized? And the answer is no. We see that overbet sizings are not used on the Ace-Queen-Jack, and they're not used on the Code Red textures either. So on something like a 10-9-8 or a 10-9-7, overbet sizings are either not used or they're just not very frequent. However, we also see that the smaller sizings are not used as much, so 33% is no longer going to be the most common sizing. Everything is in that 50 to 75% region. So focusing on Ace-Queen-Jack, why are large but non-overbet sizings incentivized on something like the Ace-Queen-Jack? And it's to do with the nutted equity distribution. On something like the Ace-Queen-4, we have the stone cold nuts, and our opponent doesn't. But on something like the Ace-Queen-Jack, we still have the stone cold nuts, which is now King 10, but our opponent, who's perhaps cold calling out of the big blind, also has the stone cold nuts. He also has King 10. So it's that nutted equity distribution that drives the overbetting strategy on Broadway heavy textures. But on an Ace-Queen-Jack, we no longer have the nutted equity distribution, and therefore we don't make use of overbet sizings. Having said that, Ace-Queen-Jack is still a very good texture for the pre-flop aggressor, and that's why we see 50% and even 75% sizings used very commonly. We obviously have strong holdings like sets and 2-pair that want to bet 75% pot, but they don't necessarily want to overbet because it will then be too expensive when they run into the stone cold nuts in the defender's range, the King 10 on the Ace-Queen-Jack board. 10-9-8 is very similar. Of course, a 10-9-8 is not as good for the PFR as something like the Ace-Queen-Jack, but we do still see very similar principles in the sense that the ideal bet sizings get condensed. So we don't see the very small sizings as much on the 10-9-8, but we don't see the overbet sizings either. Everything ends up in that 50% or 75% region. Whether it's 50% or 75%, again, it's going to depend on the specific texture, but middling sizings are incentivized, whereas overbet and very small sizings not so incentivized on the Code Red or Crusher textures. One key takeaway from all of this, and perhaps to help as a memory aid as well, is that the overbetting strategy is often driven by the nutted equity distribution. So on any specific flop texture, think about which of the two players involved has the nuts. If we have the nuts in our range, but our opponent doesn't, that's usually a good indication that we should be making use of overbet strategies. Let's touch on one final texture. This is again fairly different from many of the other textures, and that is the monotone texture. So we have 3 cards, all of the same suit. So it could be something like 8-7-6, all of spades, or A7 deuce, all of diamonds. These are very similar to paired textures strategically, in the sense that the larger sizings disappear completely. So if we're ever using an overbet sizing on a monotone texture, then we should just keep in mind that GTO-wise, that's incorrect. Doesn't mean it's always incorrect exploitatively, but GTO doesn't overbet on monotone textures. So again, it's another one of those textures that does coincide fairly well with the approach of hammering the 1/3 sizing. We've seen some textures lend themselves fairly well to that, whereas other textures, it seems like surely we can't be getting the best of it if we're consistently using the 1/3 sizing. Okay, just a few words in conclusion. It's great to have a GTO-based discussion, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're looking to play GTO. And I'll say this regarding any discussion on GTO. It's great to understand the theory, but we're not necessarily trying to execute GTO strategies directly. All we're trying to do here is get a deeper understanding of how the mechanics of the game works, and then we can use that information to help underpin our exploitative strategies. But generally, we're not looking to play GTO. Ideally, we should be looking to play exploitative poker. In the quest to play a strong exploitative game, it's a great idea to have a rough idea of what GTO is doing on different board textures, and that's what we've done in this session. We've considered GTO Cbet sizing on a range of different common textures. So this hopefully allows us to do 2 things. Number 1, it should increase our awareness of the different board textures and how they're strategically different, but hopefully it should also expand our creative options. If we've perhaps in the past been thinking that we can't overbet the flop, or it's wrong to overbet the flop, or we have to always c-bet 1/3 on the flop, we now know that there are other options. Overbetting can be a great idea, both as an exploit, but also just because it's GTO correct to have an overbetting range on specific flop textures. So if you've never ever overbet c-bet the flop, why not give it a try based on some of the principles we've discussed in this podcast episode? All right, thanks a lot for listening, guys. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.